be a... Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I would like to call this City Council portion of the City Council Port Authority concurrent meeting to order.
And I would like to call the Port Authority back into session.
Carolyn, if we could call the roll for the City Council, please.
Lohman,
Here.
Nelson,
Here.
Beloga,
Here.
Martin,
Here.
Carter, Holter,
Present.
6 present. Oh, Bussey.
Bussy is here as well. We have 6 of the 7 members of the City Council present this evening.
And,
You are wearing a mask.
and Carolyn, would you call the roll for the Port Authority again?
Peterson,
Present.
Keller,
Present.
Bussey,
Present?
Erickson,
Present.
Bunds,
Here.
Hunt,
Present.
Carter. 6 present.
We have 2 items on our agenda this evening. A final report of the business survey of the Bloomington businesses that we started at our last concurrent meeting, and then a discussion about support for the Expo, or the World's Fair, in 2027. So why don't we start with item 2.1 if we could. Final report of the business survey of Bloomington businesses. Mr. Leatherman is back with us this evening. Good evening.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be back here with you.
I will bring this up.
Okay.
1 second.
Perfect.
There you go.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And basically, I think I'm back to answer 2 of the questions, the big questions that came out of the report on the key takeaways. And one of them, in thinking about it, was, are there differences looking at the demographics of the businesses? Is there one type of business, one area of the city that there's more levels of concern than others? But then also the bigger question about what the takeaway is. And in thinking about what to look at to advise the city moving forward, and I talked about it last time, is that you're in an enviable position. The survey was very positive. Business owners and managers are very pleased in the city of Bloomington. So the shift isn't from changing people's minds from unfavorable to favorable. The shift is, how do you make them enthusiastic? How do you move them from good to excellent? How do you move them from agree to strongly agree? And in looking at this then, my business partner and I sat down with the data, and we did what's called an answer tree, and trying to look at the differences in businesses that were more unfavorable and what are the key driving factors or the questions related back to that rating. And looking at it, 2 variables came into play. It was their view of the current business climate in the city, if they rated it less than excellent, and it was their optimism of the future of their business in Bloomington. Those 2 things tied together drove the perception of what what Bill and I decided to label.
Sorry.
Oh.
Next one?
Are you gonna have? Nope, this is fine. Are you gonna have to click it then? Should I have you do it?
No, but I need to do something else.
Sorry, I interrupted her.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so first off, as we go through the data for comparison's sake, I've kept in the overall results and some key questions, so you're reminded of what the results were for all 400 businesses. And to keep in mind that that sample, that 400 is projectable to plus or minus 5%. Then what we told the computer to do is we pulled out the businesses that reported the current business climate was less than excellent and that they were less than very optimistic about the future of their business in Bloomington. That was 129 out of the 400 sample. So 32% of businesses fell into this category. Now, as we go to a lower sample size, the margin of error goes up. So keep in mind when we're looking at this, the margin of error for this sample is plus or minus 8.8. So what I've done on some of these questions, and we're going to go through with the demographics first, is just to see, are there statistically significant differences on the demographics? That would give you some inclination that this is an area, a geographic area, a service area, all of those things. And there really isn't. The concern is broad base. If we look at the first one, are there any differences on the longevity of the time of the business has been in Bloomington? There are none. If you add up over 10 years, it's on the edge of statistical significance, but still it's pretty widespread across the longevity. What about the demographic question on what type of business is it? Is there any difference on retail? Retail is up 2%. It has to be greater than 8% to be statistically significant. Everything is within 2 to 4% across all the businesses, indicating what I've labeled the less than enthusiastic compared to the overall. On the next chart, we finally hit 2, and I flagged them in red to make it easier to see. The location. There is one area that was more likely to be less than enthusiastic, that group, and that was if they said their business was on the 494 strip. It was actually right at the edge. They were 9% higher. Everything else was within the normal range. They were also more likely, this group, to be owners of their buildings or their facility instead of tenants. That actually moved from 25 to 34%. If we look at the makeup of the employee base in the company, there are no differences between full-time businesses and the less than our full-time employees. There is a difference on if they have part-time employees. They're less likely to have 1 in 10 part-time employees, but it actually distributes to they either have none or they have more than 10. It's not one group or the other. But the full-time base, there are no differences.
To go.
There we go. Any difference in the age of the respondent? There are none. In the ethnicity, there are no differences. There is a 6% increase of the Latino, Latina, and Latinx. It goes from 6 to 12%. It's not statistically significant, though. And then finally, on the demographics, are there any differences on gender? Men are more likely to be less than enthusiastic, but it's not statistically significant. It's a 7-point increase, and there's no difference on the zip code. So that 494 strip, the location stretches a few zip codes, but so it's not located in just one. So to answer the council's question and the Port Authority's question from earlier, are there any areas of the demographics to flag to focus on? No. The less than enthusiastic, and as we're going to see going through this, and what we talked about earlier when I was here the last time, it's much more about macroeconomics than microeconomics, going into their concern about their feeling on the current business climate and their optimism for the future. So in looking at some of the questions, and I also wanted to point out, I didn't put the chart up because interestingly enough, one factor that the computer and the answer tree did not put out, and it was a hypothesis that Bill and I had, was they would be more likely to say the pandemic had a major impact. There was no difference amongst the less than enthusiastic and the overall business. 50% said it was a major impact, just like the overall. The pandemic was not the driving factor. So, a couple open-endeds. We asked, if you remember in the survey, is there anything in an open-ended response the city could do to improve the business climate? The only difference is at the bottom, the no. They have more suggestions, but they don't coalesce around one or two items. Lowering taxes does double. It's not statistically significant. You also have a doubling of employee training and tax incentives, but they're not statistically significant. What it is they have more suggestions, but there's not one thing. It's not the silver bullet, shall we say, to say, okay, this is going to make these folks move from good to excellent, from agree to strongly agree. What do they view the most serious issue facing their business in the community? Once again, there's not just one thing, but it's statistically significant that they point to something. Those saying there are no problems, there are no serious issues in the city of Bloomington, goes from 49% down to 35%. You do see a doubling on the lack of customers from 5 to 11%. On other items, high rent and lease come up. Sign restrictions, lack of employees, they increase a little bit, but it's not statistically significant. So they're just more likely to offer something as a serious issue, but they're not coalescing around one or two items again. Now, we did then go through a list, and we asked them, for each of these, is this a very serious issue for your business, a somewhat serious issue, or not a serious issue at all? In going through and looking at the red to give the city some direction on what the focus of the most serious issue facing the business is, the general economic conditions, the macroeconomics, it goes from 37% saying very serious among all businesses up to 50%. The cost of doing business, the very serious category, almost doubles from 23 to 40%. The high rent or lease actually doubles from 16 to 30%. The lack of customers double from 10 to 22%. Access to capital and healthcare costs also double. What stays, where are there no statistically significant differences? Traffic congestion, the amount of city taxes, crime rates, availability of public transportation, and the access to high-speed internet. On the crime, there is a statistically significant increase in the somewhat serious, the soft category, and that goes from 36 to 55%. So that might be something to consider, but the thing that differentiates this is looking at the very serious. Who feels that this is intensely a serious issue? And so there are statistically significant differences, but all are kind of wrapped up at the federal, the state, and more macroeconomic than the microeconomics of local government at this time. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the labor pool to see if that was driving. And remembering back, the time frame for this survey was in June. And that was kind of where the employee shortage and all that discussion was happening in the news. Now, obviously, we have other factors coming into play, supply, the supply system, everything like that, inflation. But back in June, this group, they were not statistically significantly different on the quality of the labor pool. It was an 8-point difference from 13 to 21% on the overall quality. But even this group, the less enthusiastic, rated the quality of the labor pool in Bloomington at 76% favorable. On the quantity of employees, I gotta go back. There we go. On the quantity of employees, there are two statistically significant differences. So the quality is not the concern that it was back in June. It was the quantity. The excellent rating drops 10 points, and the only fair and poor rating goes up by 11 points to 28%. Still, though, overall, keeping in mind this group, you still had 69% rating the labor pool favorably. So in looking at, potential areas for the city to focus on, and I think when we get to the end and we look at incubators and partnerships, it really is something that makes a lot of sense to lay and build that foundation in the city so that when the macroeconomics in this country and in the state become more normal, shall we say, the foundation is in place for some of these other things that are a concern for these businesses.
I have a question. Should I keep it till the end or interject?
I feel free. Yep.
This is the bit that confuses me because the labor pool, presumably people who are running a significantly sized business are drawing employees from the Twin Cities in general. So how do we separate? I'm not sure even how to ask this question. The labor pool means who?
It is the labor pool for the business, and you're right, it goes beyond the city borders, obviously. I mean, in a metropolitan area, it's not going to be just focused on the labor pool in Bloomington. The question is focused on the labor pool for that business.
Okay.
And then looking and going beyond that and asking them for the competencies they're looking for and those sorts of aspects. But it is not saying the labor pool in Bloomington.
Yeah, and obviously I asked because when we take the next step to what the city can do, so much of that is beyond our control, contribution, borders, however we want to define that.
Potentially, yes, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, I just double checked and wanted to look to see do they have any differences in how they feel about the city itself. And looking at the differences on the mayor and the staff, I just decided let's just do one chart. There are no statistically significant differences on how they feel on the city. And so I just chose the city's attitudes and responsiveness towards local business. Overall, it was 90%. Amongst this group, it was 88%. The only fair and poor was 10% amongst the overall, 12% amongst this group. The relationship and the feeling that overall in the community, and even with this group, the less enthusiastic, they're still overwhelmingly positive on the city enterprise. Now, are there any differences? And we went through a list of 12 items and asked, should the city of Bloomington put a great focus on this for businesses in the community? Some of a focus, not too much, or none at all. What I continue to array on this chart is the great and some, in keeping in mind that for all businesses, you had vast majorities saying it should be at least some focus. So really they're saying do it all. What differentiates though, and what we look at is the intensity, the blue. Do they feel it's some or great? Now there are two statistically significant differences among this group of the less than enthusiastic. What continues to remain at the top of the list are retaining and growing existing businesses. It was 70% in the overall a great focus. It was 65% in the less than enthusiastic group. Recruiting new businesses, 63% overall. Amongst the less than enthusiastic, 55%. There is a statistically significant drop, interestingly enough, on the low-interest small business loans for this group. That actually dropped from 50% great focus to 41%. If we continue to go down the list, it pretty much mirrors then, except then we get down to building traffic infrastructure. That actually, a great focus for the less than enthusiastic, goes from 32 to 48%. So what we did then at this point is I went into the computer and I wanted to pull out those that said it was a great concern, and I ran that against where their location was. And going back to the demographics, keeping in mind that the one area that there was higher levels, it was on the 494th strip. So if they were on the 494 strip, it was almost a 1-to-1 that they said a great focus on building traffic infrastructure. So that would go back then to kind of the question on the labor pool. Is it the interstate highway system? Is it state roads? Is it county roads? Or is it, city roads that they're talking about infrastructure? The location of the business would indicate it's more than likely the 494 strip is where the focus is and they're desiring to be. So at the end of the day, what should the city do moving forward? The focus for all businesses and for the group that's less than enthusiastic, and with the goal to keep those that are happy, and to make the ones that are not as happy, but they're still happy, very happy. it remains the top two. The focus on retaining, growing existing businesses and recruiting new businesses, having a majority and almost 2/3 at the top saying it should be a great focus for the city. Then, in looking at two kind of ideas we put into the survey on the idea of a business incubator, and we explained this to the owners and managers, what an incubator was, and asked, does this sound like a good idea? And how it relates back to the second line of the great focus on new businesses. You have 84% of all businesses indicating that this is a good idea. Amongst the less than enthusiastic, it's 77%. In this day and age, on any idea you put out there, it's hard to have 80% agree on anything in this day and age. This makes a lot of sense, and it pairs back to that one of those top two priorities. And similarly, the idea of partnerships with schools, and I didn't fit it on there, with local community colleges, and developing those partnerships for the workforce. And that can relate back then to the quality of the labor pool, the quantity of the labor pool being available amongst the community, amongst the businesses overall. It was 98%. And amongst the less than enthusiastic, it was 98%. Clearly, there's mandates on these two very specific ideas that this is the right thing to do for the community. Will it be the one thing then that moves them from good to excellent? The data would indicate that all it will do will build the foundation, because it is the general macroeconomics that are driving the less than enthusiastic at this point in June. Their feelings on the current status of the climate and their concern for the future. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Leatherman. City Council members, any questions?
Port Authority members? I just want to go back to the comment I made before. I mean, these numbers are obviously very strong, and I had asked you the last time you made it, how does this compare to others around, and I think you said very favorably. I mean, so I think that's something that's important to stress with this. It's always difficult to figure out exactly what people want, but I think maybe one of the most important things is that we ask the question, and that we go to the business community and say, what can we do for you? I recall my days at SuperValue, and our CEO at the time sent a letter out to our retailers. And he was amazed at the information he got back, and it was really good stuff. So I think that this whole process is one that's good and should be done occasionally. Steve?
Thank you. There was a point made earlier kind of asking, what can we do about this? And I think the presentation got into that a little bit, but I remember conversations that talked about kind of workers within a certain time distance of commuting and availability that way. And so when I think about the kind of quantity of workers equation, kind of the work that's already been going on around housing and work that's going on around transportation to increase job access for people, it seems like continuing to make sure that we're focusing on that is something that we can do to contribute to that. And I think the other thing we have to pay attention to is watching how this changes as we kind of come out of the pandemic impacts. Because one of the things when you look at kind of some of the information that's coming in around why people aren't going back to work, and part of it is there's certain sets of people who work was kind of a discretionary activity for them. Maybe retired people who used it to earn a little bit of extra money, or high school kids who are out working, and maybe there's a set of people that are saying, no, I'm not going to do it right now. And so I think the other thing we've got to kind of watch on that is make sure we're not, because this was done during the pandemic, that we're not overreacting to that data, and that we watch a little bit and say, okay, is this trend continuing, or as the pandemic gets done and we do another one of these surveys, does it snap back maybe to some pre-pandemic or some norm maybe that's between where we're at right now and a pre-pandemic norm?
Mr. Keller?
Better stated than me, but that's exactly where I was going with my questions. Because it's interesting that we're talking about business, but I think you hit the proverbial nail on the head when you talk about the relationship amongst housing, business, and this 3 million people just not working anymore. Because I believe, particularly given our weather here, that the inconvenience of living in Brooklyn Park and working in Bloomington, and people not really wanting to spend an hour on the road, means that I think, and we'll see soon, I think, that I suspect all sorts of things contribute to people's willingness to work in a certain place or to work at all. And the more we look at, we're back to affordable housing here, the more affordable housing we have in the city, I would think would make a place for people who would live in a much closer proximity to businesses in the city. And that's one of the reasons I've always thought that the affordable housing, just in addition to just being the right thing to do, was important. So I commend you for saying it so much better than I could. But I'd like us to collectively keep that in mind as we move into the housing issues that the port in particular has so much to do with. Because I would be interested down the line, as Steve suggested, to find out if that was an underlying perception of some of the folks who are talking about traffic or what have you, that has to do with infrastructure that makes living here and as an employee of a business here a relationship of importance. I would say that would always be important to me, but I just think we had to have that in the back of our minds when we talk about what seemingly unrelated issues going forward. That's it for me.
And I agree with you, Commissioner Keller. It's and Commissioner Peterson. It's all tied together, without question. It's the housing, transportation, the worker readiness, and it's what it all comes down to in terms of those three things, how they work together. I think, and I think a lot of what we heard tonight through this kind of bears that out.
And just to reinforce the point, because I absolutely agree. Once we're out of this, quote unquote, the data would suggest you will have a natural shift from good to excellent, from agree to strongly agree. And that's why, in thinking about how to move forward, is it good enough, or is it laying foundational things that have been discussed and that we've talked about previously, so that when it's good up here, is the foundation strong too?
Well, to build on that point, obviously the pandemic is unprecedented, but almost by definition, the coming out process will have to be unprecedented as well. And Commissioner Peterson made that point when it talks to the people coming out of the workplace and decided not to do it. And it will be a while before we see what all those things are. But I think the convenience is a major factor in people's happiness. Other businesses have located here for that reason, and convenience and amenities and all of those things that we've been working on. So I don't think we'll know for a while, but I can't help but think it's a contributing factor.
I think we're looking at job security for you, Mr. Leatherman, because we're going to have to see you in about 24 months here, without question.
I'll tell you what, I don't want to
Not
go through
sooner.
a pandemic in order to ensure job security.
I saw
Commissioner
Councilmember Lohman first, and then if we can go to Commissioner Hunt. Councilmember Lohman.
So, we've done a citizen survey every year, and we've done a business survey, and I was kind of thinking about this as I was reading over the material, and I wonder from a standpoint, when we look at transportation and housing, does it make some sense to, and I don't know if this even exists, but I'll ask it anyways, if there is such a survey that would just look at labor, for example, just the labor force itself, and look at some of those issues, wage. I know we're looking at family sick time and that type of thing, and so I'm just curious if there is such a survey out there that just looks, at the labor force, maybe trying to exclude some of the management, or you take it in, but you're able to separate that out and see what their opinions are of things. I'm not sure you would do it, often, but I'd be curious to see if some of these things might look a little different with that demographic.
Yeah, I mean, we've done numerous business surveys, but not going down to the labor force. When we do residential community surveys, we will get into a few employment, we always, what they're doing in their position, their feelings on housing, their feelings on transportation that you can link back, pardon me, but not kind of on wages and those sorts of aspects. It would be a logical thing to do at some point potentially, because keep in mind, and we looked at it and talked about it last time, the perceptions on owners and managers, they didn't see the demand for affordable housing. Not surprisingly, in that sense, it's missing the labor force itself.
And I would be particularly interested, since we have such a large retail and hospitality industry here in Bloomington, to be able to do that, because you really can't get at that demographic data. Certainly we could add a question on the citizen survey, but I just think it'd be a little easier to get that. Maybe we can't get that access to those employees, but I'd be curious if we could do something like that down the line.
Yeah, for our city surveys, we actually classify it. We have an owner-manager category. And then you have blue-collar, clerical sales, all of that sort of thing. So it'd be very easy to pull that group out and then look at the remaining group.
Commissioner Hunt?
I have two comments. The 494,
Commissioner Hunt, could you put your microphone down so we can?
thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Is that better? The
Much
494 grouping, you also had zip code groupings.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a certain segment of 494 that had the bigger,
No.
okay.
No, that was what was interesting, because when I typed in the 494, I was thinking, okay, one of these zip codes is going to pop up. No, it was
It was just straight across.
the difference was them classifying themselves as being on the 494 strip,
Okay,
not the zip code they were in.
okay. My other comment was just on given that this was the survey of business owners, managers, I didn't make the jump that maybe others did about the affordable housing. I didn't see that as something that we were talking about, or that was coming up in the surveying this particular group of business owners. So I wouldn't want us to automatically, based on this survey, jump to, therefore, we have this affordable housing issue. Certainly, interviewing different levels of people, and certainly we need to be mindful of it, but I was kind of concerned about the jumping there where, as a result of this survey, which I wasn't seeing the connection there based on the responses.
Could I respond to that, since I started that whole discussion? It wasn't my intent in any event to single that out as a single thing. It's a quality of life issue, and economics are a big factor in the quality of life, certainly. But the whole parks thing, all of those other things that fit into why someone would want to live here, regardless of income, are part of a cluster of issues. And I just thought that perhaps affordable housing was the least readily apparent and the most likely to be, not looked at. But I also agree with our council member here that it would be fascinating to ask employers to give us some access to their employees, to ask what they perceive to be the importance of relationship of all of those issues to where they look for a job. Because I suspect we will find that some increasing importance. The city has looked at this stuff from time to time, and I forget exactly what the program is, but we've had, service provider individual of the year things that I think Chabella wins every time with some waitress there or waiter there. So didn't mean to do this one-to-one thing. I think it's one-to-many. It's just that, again, I thought that was the least obvious, so perhaps it was the most important thing to raise as a consciousness-raising exercise.
Any additional questions? Comments?
Port Authority?
Very good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leatherman.
Thank you.
We'll see you again in 2 years. It's,
6 months later.
So what we'd look for now from the city council is a motion to accept the final report on the business survey results.
So moved. Second.
A motion by Councilmember Martin, a second by Councilmember Coulter to accept the results of the business survey. No further council discussion? Ms. Lane?
Beloga,
Aye.
Coulter,
Aye.
Loman,
Aye.
Martin,
Aye.
Nelson,
Aye.
Bussey.
Aye.
Thank you.
Motion carries 6-0.
And I would entertain a similar motion for the Port Authority.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Commissioner Peterson, seconded by Commissioner Hunt. Any further discussion? Carolyn, do you want to call the roll?
Bussey,
Aye.
Hunt,
Aye.
Keller,
Aye.
Lunds,
Aye.
Peterson,
Aye.
Erickson.
Aye.
6-0.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's some interesting information to have in front of us, and
Really is.
I want to make sure this isn't one of those reports that just sits on the shelf, because I think there's a lot we can do with that information that we have gleaned, and putting that together with our community resident survey, I think would be very useful, and I think we should take a look at that. Our second item tonight, and final item, is a discussion on the Expo, World's Fair, and the support for that. We've got a couple of pieces of this. We're going to, I think we're going to have a presentation by either Shane or Jamie. We're going to talk through it. We are going to take public comment on this, talking about what we're going to be talking about. So we're looking for public comment either here in the council chambers, or we'll take it on the phone. And then we'll move it toward a discussion regarding some motions that are laid out there regarding council and then Port Authority support of the Minnesota USA Expo bid. So, Mr. Verbrugge or Mr. Rudling? Who's taking it? Mr. Rudling.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. President, council members, and commissioners. Just share a presentation here. Okay. It's been a little while since we've had any action on the expo, but that's what we're here to consider this evening. But along with that, we'll give current state of things and a little bit of review, just for the public and for all of us as we talk about the World Fair. So again, what is an expo? Expos come in two main variants. We in the U.S. call them World's Fairs. The rest of the world calls them expos generally. Kazakhstan had an expo, a smaller 62-acre or smaller expo in 2017. And in 2015, Milan had a large expo, and Dubai is currently having Expo 2020 right now in 2021, delayed due to the pandemic. In Milan, there was 22 million visits to that larger expo in Europe. Expo 27 is Healthy People, Healthy Planet, wellness and well-being for all, focused on what Minnesota does really well as it relates to the business community and otherwise. The Bureau of International Exhibitions organizes these World's Fairs, these expos, and they meet twice a year in Paris. And really what an expo is, it's a combination of a state fair, a little bit of a trade show, and then you've got some diplomacy that happens too with world leaders coming to these things. The Milan Expo in 2015 was a huge geographical expo. It had 70 buildings spread out over 271 acres. There were 9 different clusters. And the public fair portion of it had, 22 million visits. It was a large kind of linear event. There were business pavilions, so there's a lot of marketing that happens, both externally to the public and then internally in these pavilions. The U.S. Pavilion is one of the most popular ones because, frankly, the U.S. is looked up to quite a bit, and they expect a lot from us. They leave behind public art, and they have government connections with a daily parade featuring one country. So if you've got over 100 participants and over 100 days at these larger events, you get roughly one country each day having it be their day. Kazakhstan had again, the smaller expos that happen on the years that aren't zeros or fives. And they built a permanent development there that has, again, over 62 acres, a large science museum in the middle of it based on energy. And they connected theirs to a mall. It left behind public art, and they had these permanent buildings that were left behind that can be converted into business uses after the event. And the Dubai Expo is happening right now, and they plan to take the site that they have built, which is hugely impressive. If you haven't seen media coverage, I encourage you to go check it out online. They want to make it a global community for the future. So that brings us to Expo 2027 that Minnesota is bidding for. We sometimes joke that it's the only thing, perhaps, that President Obama, Trump, and Biden all agreed on, is to bring an expo back to the U.S. and Minnesota. They all took official action to allow that to happen. And it has bipartisan support in Congress and from the Minnesota delegation as well. So, rewinding time back to 2017 for the Expo 2023 effort, really, nobody was quite sure the federal government was going to do what they did in the first half of 2017 and allow the United States to rejoin the Bureau of International Exhibitions. And that started a 6-month sprint, really, after it was May 12th, I think, where President Trump ultimately signed a bill into law that allowed the U.S. to do these things again. The city engaged at that point, got a purchase agreement on the Spruce Shadows Farm and worked with the Mall of America to get an agreement on the land to the east, which is the adjoining lands. We started a consultant contract that studied logistics, transportation, parking, et cetera, and financials and a draft pro forma for the project. And then the BIE vote happened on November 15 of 2017, with the vote going to Argentina. And Argentina has since canceled their plans for the expo due to the pandemic and economic concerns in that country. So the Expo 2027 effort really began in late November of 2017. I honestly was a little bit surprised. I was, we were still licking our wounds, if you will, from the vote in mid-November of 2017. But the organizers from the Minnesota USA Expo were, pushing for a future expo right after the vote. And so we've been monitoring that effort for a number of years and engaging where appropriate. And, this summer, really federal recognition, which, again, nobody knows what any particular federal government is going to do, but in the summer of 2021, the federal government recognized the Minnesota Expo effort. And that project is a very live project sitting here today. And they've got 2 milestones coming up over the next year and a half. Actually, it's closer to a year now. This dossier and inquiry visit that will be submitted, and then this inquiry visit that will happen sometime between February and May of 2022. And if that goes well, then the BIE vote will happen in November of 2022. At this point, there are not other countries formally in the race for an expo in 2027-28 timeframe, although we've heard that Malaga, Spain is a potential competitor. And so why would the U.S. want to hold an expo? And I think this really boils down to what we put in the packet, and this kind of follows along what was in the packet. There are other both benefits and risks that we could talk about, but these are the big benefits. And so for the world, expos really bring countries together in a setting that is more about celebrating our likenesses than complaining about our differences. And the lead up to the expo has an intense amount of activity and staff, and frankly a lot of young people to get together, build their pavilions, and get to know each other in a setting that isn't adversarial typically. So countries that are viewed as adversaries, sometimes they're right next to each other. In the Milan Expo, for example, the Iran pavilion was very close to the pavilion from Israel. So those people saw each other across the street, literally, which that doesn't happen all the time. So they eat their food, they sit in their cafes, and it's too strong to say that an expo is going to bring about world peace, but it can't hurt the effort, that's for sure. Expo benefits for the United States. So the Department of Commerce is very interested in expos because it's their job to increase the commerce of the United States and trade globally. And so expos can help that. They make business connections, they bring businesses together. Governments and businesses from the U.S. and other countries meet because they're in town, and that all helps grease the skids of international trade, if you will. It's a great marketing and branding opportunity for the country that's hosting the expo. And, U.S. diplomatic leadership and democracy. I mean, the world really does look to the U.S. for leadership on this front, and, recent times haven't helped our branding on that front, frankly. And so it's just amazing to me when you meet with these governments and from around the world, and how they look to the U.S. truly for leadership on many fronts. There's been limited U.S. engagement in expos in the past 40 years, while other countries have been very focused on them. We're in competition with lots of other countries, and they are very engaged. China's extremely engaged. Lots of other countries use this as a marketing tool and to show the world that they've got their act together, and a lot of them really do. Benefits for Minnesota. I think the biggest one is just simply growing Minnesota businesses. The expo, again, there's a public side to it, but there's also a side that happens outside the expo's walls. And that's really, building on the health and wellness sector that Minnesota is really strong in already, but we should continue to do things that we're good at and grow those industry clusters. Deed and Greater MSP are excited about the opportunity. And then outside of that, just the construction of the project itself. It's an expensive project. There's lots of jobs, construction companies and things like that would benefit from the construction. Then zooming into Bloomington. The most direct, simply put, benefit to Bloomington is the admissions tax. So we would get a 3% tax on all the expo tickets. If there's 12 million tickets at roughly $35, and that's a low estimate, it could very well be higher than that. It's about 12 or $13 million. You could dedicate that funding to whatever you wanted. You can let it flow to the general fund, or you could dedicate it specifically to something like the Park System Master Plan. And that could be a lasting legacy for from the expo. Less tangible, but still quite measurable, because we could baseline it. But trying to predict, hotel revenue is tricky, as we've learned over the past year and a half. That's for sure. But there's no doubt that an expo, not only during the event, but before and after the event, would bring a lot of folks to this area. And those general fund revenues would flow, obviously, to the general fund. And then there's side benefits to the Convention and Visitors Bureau and the South Loop Development Fund. It's a three-month event, but again, it's probably 6 to 9 months on the front end where you see intense activity and lots of contractors and countries, and then after the expo to convert it to its legacy use. Bloomington would get a lot of visibility. Business development would thrive during that time. Again, I spoke about the country days, each day at the expo. Dignitaries and a parade would happen in Bloomington. You get a lot of media focus. You have these people staying in our city. The mayor and council people would be pressing a lot of palms during those time periods. So you've got the president of Country X coming to visit, and you might see that on your morning show, CNN or whatever. And then those leaders of the countries, they bring along their respective commerce folks, their business people, and they want to do business with America. There's no doubt about that. So there's a lot of activity in offsite boardrooms, business locations, hotels, and areas like that. And then, public art and placemaking. Certainly, expos have left behind some of the world's most iconic landmarks. Now, certainly Bloomington or Minnesota wouldn't see the Eiffel Tower or the Space Needle, but something like that could happen here if done right. Just hasn't been invented yet. And then, one of the things that, for the Port Authority in particular and Port staff, we focus on is the permanent development post-expo. We want to make sure that if an expo happens in Bloomington, those buildings are economically viable for post-expo uses. So, to the, if this gets going and starts gaining the momentum that we think it will, multiple meetings and working groups with DEED, Greater MSP, the businesses, developers, and brokers to make sure that what we're building is economically viable for businesses after the expo is of just critical importance. You could envision an innovation hub focusing on the bioeconomy, the med tech, wellness tech sector, thriving in South Loop, developing, the 62 acres of our key development district in one fell swoop. And so that's obviously very attractive to us economic development folks. In order to do that, you probably do need some state and federal assistance in order to make that happen. And so there's a lot of things to do, but it's a very exciting project if it can be executed well. No project is without risks. So, that's why today as staff we're recommending a measured approach to the expo. And I'll get to that in a second. There's certainly an opportunity cost, right? If we expend the effort in working on the expo now, it means we're not working on other things. It all comes down to a vote that happens in November of 2022. And if we lose the vote, then we lose all that time and effort and money that we've spent on the project. I think the other biggest risk is that the expo event isn't successful. It's not executed well or something like that, or even after the vote, if the financing doesn't come through for X, Y, or Z, you don't have a successful event. It certainly needs to be said out loud that that's a possibility, right? We can't, we're not in control of that, and it is something that could happen. So the other thing is, if we decide to move forward with the project, we're going to have to secure land. And if we do that, we may be in the position of purchasing land, and then either if you, again, lose the vote in November, or if after that the project fails for some reason, we own land that we wouldn't maybe have typically purchased. In that scenario, I think what you have is, I call it simple redevelopment only. It's land that you may want to redevelop for just, again, like SIC-like uses that we have done already. And there are a number of those out there. Surprisingly, the pandemic hasn't really affected a lot of real estate development. Obviously, for certain types of uses, office and hotel development is way down for obvious reasons, but there's still a lot of people out there really poking around and looking to build something coming out of the pandemic. And so that, I think, is a mitigatable risk. I don't know if that's a word or not, but I used it. And again, no project is without risk. Those are probably the big ones. So what's the timeline? We're in the fourth quarter of 2021 today, trying to do our consideration of these motions tonight and address the level of engagement that the city and the Port Authority want to partake as it relates to Expo. And then in the February to May timeline, again, the BIE will have an inquiry mission, and the dossier needs to be submitted. That needs to all go well in order for the project to move on to the November 2022 vote. And then after that, you've got 4 years to develop the event and the development. The planning and delivery of the event is of critical importance, and that group is up and running now. And so again, measured approach, you'll see in the motions, the recommended motions, which of course can be modified, that we recommend that Bloomington publicly state we want to be the host city and the host site and actively pursue the land for the project. And that will kick off site planning and other things. Event delivery and whether there's a public-private partnership for the project itself is to be determined. We don't know the answers to those questions today. And these are the motions. They're the same that are in the packet. And I know, as the mayor mentioned at the front of the meeting here, that we'd be taking public comment. But I'd leave it to the mayor and President Erickson how they want to do that. If there's questions of me, I'm happy to answer those. The city manager is very involved in the project as well, and I know that he's willing to answer questions also. So.
Mr. Verbrugge, something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. President. Just on the process pieces, Shane shared the timeline that we're in right now. Following the White House approval of Minnesota as the official U.S. Candidate, the U.S. government presented the letter of intent to compete at the end of July. That started the 6-month clock for other countries that are interested in competing to indicate that they will be participating as well. So the date for that is January 28th or 29th, when we will know if there are other international competitors. So when Shane says, we're aware of one, there's this time frame once a country has kicked off the process, which the U.S. did, by which other countries have to come forward. So we'll know the answer about how competitive this may be by the end of January. And I also want to point out that it's not a certainty that the U.S. would be awarded the expo if it is indeed the only competitor, just because that inquiry mission from the BIE does a very detailed look at the proposal to make sure the theme is one that's going to be interesting to all of the participating countries. They want to make sure that the finances for the proposal are likely to lead to success, and they have a number of other considerations as well. So we'll know a little bit more in a couple months where we stand in terms of how things play out over the course of the next year.
So if we have any specific questions, before we get into a discussion, let's go questions, then we'll open up the phone lines and see if anybody wants to chime in, and then we'll have our discussion. If we could line it up in that way, that would be fine.
Say Commissioner Peterson and Commissioner Luntz.
Yeah, so my question is, it seems, and I just want to verify this, but it seems like the sequence of this, like a lot of projects, is you need site control in order to kind of make a proposal that you can actually kind of come through on the project. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how the site control fits in with that? Because it seems like that's the big step that we're taking off here. That's like there'll be a point where it'll be irrevocable. It's not quite yet at that point, but it's kind of starting us down that path.
Thank you, Mr. President and Commissioner Peterson. Yeah, so the site control is a big part. Obviously, in 2017, we had a partner in 555 with the adjoining lands, and we did a purchase agreement with the Spruce Shadows Farm, which was ultimately canceled because of the loss of the vote. And also, well, we held on to that for an extra month or two because the Amazon thing was still hanging out there. And then when that didn't happen for Minnesota, we let the purchase agreement go. So, so the next step is certainly site control. And we're in conversations with a number of groups to start that process. We haven't made any offers or anything like that, but we are in conversations to start that process so that we're not starting flat-footed here after tonight if the council and port direct us to do that work. And so you could have a scenario where we have site control either for Expo or for regular development. And that's certainly a potential outcome where, we buy these properties and we have public sources to do that. And if Expo falls apart, then we have other things that we can do with the properties, like, again, SIC-like development. And so those are the next steps for sure.
Commissioner Luntz?
I'm getting feedback. I have some linked questions. One, Shane, could you refresh us on the purchase agreement in 2017 on the Kelly land? How much land? What was the price? How much was there earnest money left on the table to the Kelly heirs family? I'd like to be refreshed on that. And then of the total of 62 acres, how much would the Kelly farm be comprised in the 62 acres necessary? That 62 acres is a maximum, okay? And then lastly, which is a little off it, but I still think it's tied, where would the space shuttle project fall into this? If anywhere, I would think it would be another real plus if that were obtained and for Bloomington to be selected by the BIE to host the expo.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner Lunds. I will try to remember all those questions, and if I forget
I
one,
got them down here.
you remind me. So, the purchase agreement for the Spruce Shadows Farm in 2017 was 32 million. It might have been 32.5, but it was right around there, off the top of my head. There's 58 acres of gross area on that site. About 30 to 35 of it is developable, so above the bluff. A lot of it is steep slopes and not developable. You might recall that there's a potential for Native American burials on that site as well. None have been discovered, but that is a possibility. And we had a contingency in the purchase agreement related to that. So whether or not that becomes the site again for the expo is still to be determined. There are a number of options for that.
What was the earnest money in that one?
Yep. So the earnest money was $75,000, and so we forfeited that when the purchase agreement was canceled. We basically bought an option for that time period for that amount of money. Is how that worked. And so if you've got 30 or 35 acres there on the Kelly farm, and if you combine it with the adjoining lands, which is again what we proposed in 2017, it may or may not necessarily be what we propose this time. You've got the 62 acres, which is a maximum for these smaller sized expos.
So that means maybe 27 acres of land the city already controls. It would be combined with the 35 in the Kelly farm. Okay,
That's what we had back in 17. Yep.
okay. And then space shuttle status?
So, President, Commissioners, Council members, so you recall that we had a project pre-pandemic that we were exploring that would bring a mock space shuttle to the South Loop area, and we'd build an attraction around that. There's a nonprofit that was looking to do that. Pandemic put that project on hold. I did talk to Casey Herzberg, who presented to these boards pre-pandemic here about a month ago, and she's still in a holding pattern, but the project is still a potential, and I think it's a possibility that could come back into the expo. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't a good fit. It's not specifically on the theme of health and wellness. The shuttle is, but who doesn't like a space shuttle? So, I mean, that's more conversations certainly need to be had on that. But that project is just out there. We're just not working on it actively right now.
And then one more question came to me. How much land in the South Loop that the city controls is still available? And I'm with the full understanding it may not be contiguous to the 40 acres in the Kelly site, for instance, or what's left there. So I'm just kind of wondering, what's the totality of land in the South Loop that's bare ground or is going to be bare ground with industrial develops or something that are going to be scraped?
Sure, President, Commissioners, Commissioner Lunds. So the Port Authority and/or city, and in this case, the Port Authority owns the Ramada site, which is about 11 acres, Thunderbird site. And then we own, the only other parcel that we own or control is the remaining parcels on the SIC development, which is a 14-acre total site, and roughly half of that is the first phase. And so we've got, just say 7 acres for easy math on that project. That is, of course, committed through our agreements with SIC for their future phases. So those are the only two that we own or control in South Loop currently.
And I'm sorry, I missed the first part. How much left on the Kelly land?
On
The 40 acre?
how much is developable, or
Well, I appraised the thing years ago, it was 40 acres. Okay, but some of it has been committed and whatnot, so I'm kind of wondering just how much is still developable. Talking about east of 24th, north of Old Shakopee Road.
Oh, the adjacent lands on the east side of
The
the Mall of
adjacent,
America.
yes.
Okay.
Pardon my terminology.
No, so on the adjoining lands that the mall owns, that's about 32-ish acres. And it's currently, the only thing that encumbers that property is the light rail currently. So there's no.
Is what?
The light rail.
Oh, right, well, okay.
Yep. There's no permanent structures. There are no permanent structures on that property.
And maybe, Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, maybe to clarify for Commissioner Lunds, the city doesn't control that property. That's still owned by T5.
Right.
They were a partner in our effort in 2017 and anticipate that they'll be involved in the conversation moving forward here too.
Any additional questions, Commissioner Lunds? Rob, anything else?
No,
Nope, okay.
sorry.
I wasn't sure where the list was, I'm sorry.
I got two things going here.
Got it.
There's an
Um,
echo.
So Shane, you mentioned involvement of the Department of Commerce, and obviously to be successful is to see what we've seen, to match what we've seen in other countries, there needs to be that federal government involvement. Could you explain a bit more about what the federal involvement either would be or could be, whether it's the Department of State, Department of Commerce, the Congress, how it all works together from a federal level to make something like this work?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members, and Port Authority commissioners. So, the closest paradigm that we have today is an Olympics. And Olympics is based on some government accountability GAO reports, invest heavily into Olympicses in lots of different ways through security. Operations are some of the biggest ones. Security for an event like this would be, very important and very costly effort. Same thing with an Olympics, and the federal government invests heavily into those efforts. And so, the organizers would need to, make sure that those types of investments are part of the event delivery. So this is the Minnesota USA Expo event folks who are going to deliver the project itself. But I'm curious about that because so we've read some of those reports to make sure that that level of commitment exists in the government, or at least it has for these kind of big international events in the past. Certainly not committing the federal government to anything, and nor is the federal government committed to anything. But it's not untypical for them to do that for big events. But there's no doubt that for a development, it will need some level of public subsidy through an EDA grant or some other thing like that to make the development pro forma work out. And there's no doubt that the federal government on the event delivery side will need to partake in order to make that happen. The city of Bloomington can play an important role through being the host city and site control, but we couldn't if we wanted to. We don't have that type of money to invest and deliver a project of this magnitude. It needs to be a well-funded effort, both privately and through the federal in particular and state government as well. Thank you.
Mr. Brugge?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And if I might, the State Department and the Commerce Department have clearly delineated responsibilities when it comes to participation in expos. So for the Dubai Expo or the upcoming Expo in Osaka in 2025, the State Department is the lead agency for coordinating participation in international expos. If the United States is hosting an expo, the Department of Commerce is the lead agency. So there's a bit of a handoff from one department to the other when it's on our own soil. The State Department is still very involved in coordinating all of the communication and coordination through the BIE. But for the actual oversight of the event that the U.S. is hosting, that falls into the Department of Commerce's purview.
Thank you for that clarification. Councilmember Martin.
Thank you. Two quick kind of related questions. I guess assuming we were to move forward on these motions tonight favorably, at what point will we start getting firm commitments from large-scale corporate sponsors? I'm thinking the Mayo Clinics of the world, organizations like that. And then kind of onto that with the adaptive reuse of these properties going up, would corporate partners be a part of that adaptation and that reuse, or would that be on the city of Bloomington to go in and turn those into commercially viable structures and then go try and find partners to fill them?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Martin. So it's a great question. Some of the answer is we don't know yet, but the Mayos and Medtronics and Boston Scientifics of the world, it's really the Expo Organizing Committee, Minnesota USA Expo, that first goes to those companies and asks them if they want to be part of the effort. Many of them were part of the effort back in 2017 and contributed money to that and were involved in other ways. The Expo Organizing Committee is doing that right now. They're trying to find out which Minnesota companies want to be involved in the project. And then they're going to move out to U.S. companies and then internationally as well. A lot of money needs to be raised on that front in order for it to be a successful event. Parallel to that, and important to us, is what happens to the project after, right? So, the Expo Organizing Committee needs to raise money for from corporate sponsors to fund the work that they're doing right now, and also do event delivery. And then we want to be part of that, whether it's a public-private partnership where we are doing a more active role in the development, or if we're just convening brokers and developers and businesses together to make sure that the structures are built so that businesses can use them without spending a lot of money to convert them into what they want to do with the structures, right? So there's a lot of touches of the corporate community during that time, but critical to that effort is probably our and DEED and Greater MSP's convening of a lot of different groups together to make sure that conversation happens and has a good outcome.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I was talking with Shane, and one thing that helped me to kind of get my arms around 12 million visitors is just looking at the example that we have in our own community of the Mall of America, which is generating 40 million visitors a year. So if you think over 3 months, I mean, we're fortunate that we already have a situation. I think that we can envision something like this with that number of visitors and have kind of ideas. So it was just kind of something helpful to me just in looking at this.
Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. So first, I just want to say that I really appreciate the benefits broken down and laid out the way that you have them. It's really clear, and I know it's something I've been interested to hear more about. So if the motion passes tonight, it would allow active engagement with the Minnesota Expo and then the active pursuit of the 62 acres. And so I'm interested in having a conversation about our expectations or kind of our guiding principles as we go into making those kinds of decisions. So for example, one of the things we were just talking about is what happens to the development after the expo, right? But another thing that I would be really interested in is environmental sustainability. So making sure that that's a strong consideration as we have these conversations with the committee. And so I guess I'm just wondering, at what point in the process do those conversations happen?
Rutherford?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Commissioner and Councilmember Carter.
Get it on, Shane.
It's another great question. And so if the council and Port Authority pass the motions tonight, we have a lot of work to do. And those guiding principles, environmental sustainability, equity, all those things need to be ingredients in this larger project that need to get talked about. We'd have some very preliminary conversations with Emma about this and other projects. The Expo Organizing Committee early on, even back in 2017, had identified, the key architect, he's been in front of the boards, David Lair, has been talking about sustainability. So all those things are floating out there. They're just not coalesced into a policy statement yet. But I mean, honestly, we have a lot of work to do if this thing gets going, which will put stress on staff. And it's a preview. It's part of the Port Authority budget, to add another FTE And to the extent this project starts to snowball, we're very likely have to add more people in addition to that, or hire consultants to help us out with that work, because we've got a lot of irons in the fire right now. So it's not a perfect answer. We just have a lot of work to do on those fronts, and your comments are well taken. And I think I'll speak for myself. I agree. We need those guiding principles, because kind of the main one that we've been talking to the boards about, and we've had a long time, is that we don't want an expo if it's just paving a parking lot, putting up temporary tents and buildings, and then walking away. One of the main goals is permanent development. Yeah, we've listed all these benefits, but the one that that I'm just laser focused on is making sure that we do the right thing for the city, for the post expo events, to end up with a bunch of businesses in our city. And so that one's out there, but doing it with climate and equity in mind is, of course, very important. So
That's great and super helpful. I have one other question, too.
Please.
Okay. Do you have any information on the impact that this would have on like housing prices or rental prices in the area? So I know one of the things that we've kind of struggled with in the South Loop area is that our rental prices aren't as high as places like Eden Prairie. And I'm just curious if we have any kind of information on what that impact would be.
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Carter, not specifically. We just have anecdotal information from the folks in Milan when we were meeting with them. They said, hotel prices went up considerably during the expo. The BIE does expect that you provide/make available housing for those folks that are working at the expo. They pay their own way, and they pay that. But they need to be assured that there's availability. So in 2017, we had these areas identified, some of them at Bloomington Central Station, Expo Village, sometimes this is what they're called. And so these are the people that, staff the Expo pavilions from Country X and Country Y and things like that. I'm sure that it will drive up, rental prices, at least temporarily, and have some effect on that.
Okay.
But we don't have hard numbers on it yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Lohman?
Thank you, Mayor. When looking at the packet, the benefits were well laid out, I thought. One thing that, and well thought out too, I thought, but one of the things I didn't see so much was, from the risk standpoint, having those kind of laid out so that we could kind of clearly look at that. And so, was it Argentina that had it? So I'd be interested to know, as we look at that, what were the driving forces? I mean, you said it was the pandemic, but I imagine there were more pieces of that kind of contributed to that. And are there other examples in the past where things just didn't come together? I mean, have we ever had one in the pre-40 year example in the United States where it didn't come to fruition? So that's my first question, and then I've got a secondary question.
Mr. Verbrugge?
Sure, I'll take it, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Lohman, council and commissioner members. Trying to remember the first part of the question, because I got keyed on the last part of the question, but I got it.
You start there now.
I got it.
Yeah.
So the first part, the most recent example of Argentina, what happened in Argentina? Argentina as a country has had significant economic crisis for the last couple of years. In fact, it was going on before the pandemic started. They had just really difficult inflation. They had some significant national debt issues. And combined with the impact of the pandemic, it just made it infeasible for them to host the event as a country. One of the things that's different about the United States model of doing an expo is it is very reliant on a public-private partnership model, because there's legislation, even though Shane was really good in articulating all the ways that the federal government supports significant events like this, actually paying the cost to build and conduct an expo is not a permissible use for the federal government, right? So they support it in other ways, but it's up to the host committee to do the fundraising to make sure that the enterprise is financially viable. In most of the countries around the world, It is entirely supported by the national government that is hosting. So in the case of Argentina, it was entirely reliant on the national government of Argentina to pay for the cost of the expo in their proposal. And so when they have those economic challenges, there isn't an alternative, and that's why they were unable to move forward. The most recent expo to be held in the United States was 1984 in New Orleans. That was also a specialized expo, it was a short expo, and it coincided with the Olympics in Los Angeles, and so it did not perform well, largely due to the timing and the fact that people were focused elsewhere. At least that's the history that's been shared with us as we've talked about that model. 1982, Knoxville, Tennessee, was more successful than New Orleans was. And then the last one in North America was actually in Vancouver, British Columbia. And there's, still lasting presence of the expo in Vancouver today.
So depending on how we move forward today, I'd like to see more around those risks fleshed out, because I just think that that's important for the public to know that. As we have done a nice job with those benefits, I really think that we need to kind of, what those are when we look at those other pieces. Do that. My secondary question is around the land holdings themselves. So if we were in the position where we were to acquire, let's say, the Kelly Farms, can you help me just have a historical understanding in terms of what the port has done in the past and how much land holdings we've had in the past and how that fits into that historical point of view, just so the public understands, and then also this council member understands how much that would be, and is that something that would be a drain or a problem? Just help me understand that what that would mean for the public.
Brother.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Lohman. So we have the benefit of having President Erickson here, who was around when the city was involved in the mall project. I don't know exactly how many acres that is off the top of my head, but
I think 90.
90 acres. So maybe when I'm done, he can share a little bit about that. But just to put in the context, what the port has done in the past is acquire projects and land like Mall of America, hold a ULI-led process to figure out what that project was going to be. Ultimately, we know what it is sitting here today. So that's the model. We've done that with the interstate and alpha sites. That's led to the AC, Town Place, the Hazelwood development there. The SIC project is another example. Similarly, over at BCS, we held the land where Indigo is currently for a while, took that off their books, and then sold that back to the project, and they developed it. And a similar model could happen here. So if we have 60 acres, or if we only have half of it, and if for some reason the project doesn't happen, we still have land that's economically viable to develop. And I think that's the key, and that's why we're suggesting a measured approach now, because we don't have a lot of answers to these questions, and we're not in control of many of these things. But if we do end up buying land at some point in the relatively near future, do we have an exit strategy, and what is that? And I think as long as we don't overpay for property, we do have an exit strategy, and that is the development like you've seen in the past. Again, I use SIC as an example, but the SIC-like development. So these high-tech companies, there are a number of them out there. I can't certainly sit here and guarantee today that we'd have 30 acres of SIC-like projects, but
When we compare SIC, let's say, because basically this is 1/3 of a Mall of America project, roughly. The first area. What would a SIC look like to this? I know there's, depending on how you count it, because there's the developmental, development land and that type of thing. Just so myself and the general public can have a better understanding.
Sure. Mayor and Councilmember Lohman. So the SIC project is 14 acres. An expo site is 62 acres. Not saying you'd have to buy all of that now. Perhaps you'd just buy an option on half of it, say, half on the adjoining lands or the Three Shadows Farm or another site. But yeah, then you've got that's for scale. So the SICK project is, half of 30 roughly at 14, so.
Thanks for doing that. I think that,
And to provide a little more scale, council member, the state fairgrounds are 322 acres. I mean, so think about that. Everybody knows the state fairgrounds,
Yeah,
but
that's
that's
great.
322 acres. So,
that's a great way of doing it. I like that.
I'm impressed you know that.
How much is that covered by cheese curds?
Well, Shane was mentioning, again, the city of Bloomington made a very conscious decision when the Met Stadium site became available to acquire it. And it was something that actually general obligation funding was used. And there was some general obligation funding that was used in the initial development of the mall that was paid off. But the whole idea, the whole concept is we wanted to be patient developers. We did not want, box stores, everything else. And at that point in time, you could have had a lot of things like that. And that philosophy has been what has really guided the Port Authority in all the years that I've been involved with it, that we have been patient developers. We want something that's quality. And I think when Shane talks about doing something that has legs, I used to, when I was at the University of Minnesota or on the MinSCU board, I would always look at housing projects and the buildings and things, and does this project have legs? In other words, are you taking and throwing away space that you could develop very cheaply in the future, or do you have interstate? I mean, so these concepts are very, very important. So I think that this is something that, as I look at it, is a manageable risk, and we're not even talking about general obligation funding or anything here. It's something that is financeable with resources we've had because of very prudent use of funds that have been accumulated over a period of time, and we can thank a long history in the city of Bloomington for looking at these projects and wanting, as Lyle Olson used to say, both a belt and suspenders. In other words, we want to make sure that they're fiscally responsible, and that has served us well. So I think, this is something that's good. I also just want to comment on Councilmember Lohman's comment about Argentina. Having been there 2 years ago, they're dealing with 30, 40, 50% inflation per year. And so when you're in an environment like that, nothing works.
Mr. Brugge?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and council member, to follow up on the question about the financial risk. The responsibility for the event will be bifurcated. So the primary financial risk to the city is entirely wrapped up in the development side of the project, right? So as we said 4 years ago, and we continue to say, the city is looking at this as a development project, right? So we will work with them to make sure that whatever is constructed there is something that's going to have lasting long-term benefit to the community, and it's a developable project, right? So all of the financial contingencies and protections that we build into every other agreement that we do for projects in the South Loop will be the same thing that we have here, right? So the risk to the city is the same theoretically as all the other projects and the risk that we take on in doing those. The responsibility for the actual event will reside entirely with the Minnesota USA Expo Bid Committee, or the host committee at some point if we're awarded and they transition. So they'll be responsible for the planning, the programming, the financing, all of those issues, and we'll have a really important role as the host community to be negotiating a lot of the logistics that go along with there. So to reiterate Shane's point, if indeed the dog catches the car here, we're gonna be allocating a lot of staff resource over the next 5 years in that regard, and I think that's the other big risk is just the ability to make sure that we're staffed properly to continue on with our projects and our focus that we need to do in addition to doing this as well. So I think does that give you a better sense then of how the risks lay out? Good.
Councilmember Coulter?
Thank you, Mayor. So I was sitting here listening to this last discussion, and I think, the question that comes to my mind, is the kind of question I think when maybe it's because I'm running for re-election at the moment, but the kind of question I get at the door, that folks ask me when I'm at their door. And I think what it comes down to for me is where is this money going to come from? And so I think just to sort of be clear, understanding there are a lot of variables at play and we don't exactly know what the proposal is going to look like. I mean, what are we talking about here to sort of clarify? Are we expecting that most of this would be coming from South Loop Development Fund or other city funds, or where would this funding be coming from in terms of any financial requests that are being made of the city or the port?
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Coulter. So, the only two funding sources that we have available to acquire land are the South Loop Development Fund and Mall of America TIF. And so, we don't have general fund money available for that. That's tied up. A portion of the Mall of America TIF is tied up with the mall's development project. And so we would actually be somewhat stretched to just tie up the land, okay? And so to Mr. Verbrugge's point, like event delivery, and as I stated before, is way over our skis. We don't have nearly that type of financial horsepower, even if the Council and Port Authority wanted to like engage in the delivery portion of the project. It just doesn't exist. It's quite simple. And so the organizing committee, Minnesota Expo USA, they have a lot of fundraising to do, frankly, and they're doing that right now. And it's again a key milestone. The first big milestone is this first portion of 2022. They need to be successful raising funds and creating a dossier that gets the favor of the BIE, and that mission needs to go well. That's a key milestone. And if that doesn't happen, then we have to reevaluate where we are, and it's a lot harder to make the project happen, to win the vote in 2022. And maybe you don't, maybe the Council and Port Authority at that point and staff say, okay, well, there isn't business community support. They haven't raised enough money. You rethink your level of engagement, and that's why we recommend a measured approach at this point. To investigate the land, to Councilmember Carter's point earlier, create your goals and objectives and engage in the project, because it is a very exciting project. If it can be done right, there's all these benefits that flow to all these various agencies. And again, that's why we suggest a measured approach. Okay, let's see if we can get reasonable prices on these land pieces. Can we tie up the land? That's one step. If we end up closing and the project doesn't happen at one of these future time periods for all those reasons I discussed previously, you still have developable land, right? And you're not engaged in the process. But to Mr. Rodriguez's point and the comments I made earlier, we want to be very engaged in the development process, assuming this whole thing gets rolling. But if it doesn't, it's just my nature. I create these exit ramps for us, frankly, so that we're not getting out over our skis.
Sure. Thank you. I think that's helpful for us to know and helpful for the public to hear as well. I think just sort of thinking through this in the future, if these motions move forward tonight, I think it would be helpful to have, obviously, to the greatest extent possible, understanding that may not be a very great extent at all, but kind of a sort of rough sketch of what that looks like in terms of, in terms of staff commitment, in terms of financial commitment, what that looks like moving forward from the city's perspectives. Because, at the end of the day, we are public servants, and I think it's going to be critical for us to communicate to the public exactly what the city is doing, what we're investing, what we're doing with this to the public.
Councilman Coulter, I think it's also important to reiterate the point. All the money we're talking about is what I will call fenced money. It has to be used in that area. So, I mean, again, when we look at these things, I think it's critically important to explain to the voters in Bloomington that these are dollars that have to, by definition, be used there.
And that's exactly the kind of information that I'm talking about.
Any additional questions?
Councilmember Beluga.
Beloga. Oh, Jack, I'm sorry. I didn't see your hand up. Jack, I'm sorry.
And John.
Councilmember Beloga.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Shane. I know that we've looked at this in quite a bit of detail 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm a little hazy on some of the information, so I've got a number of questions, and I'll ask them one at a time so that we don't get caught up in, did we get all the questions and all that sort of thing. So the first one is what's our opportunity cost for the city going forward? What will we be investing monetarily if we pass the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Beloga. So, as I had on the risk slide, the opportunity cost, and again, keeping with the measured approach. So the next decision point that you would have would be related to land, right? And so the opportunity cost between now and that decision is, staff time. So there's a group of us that meet internally and talk about land, and then go and negotiate with the various landowners that we're talking to. So, it's quote unquote just staff time at this point, but there is an opportunity cost to that because, we're not working on other projects. There's no doubt about that. And then as I mentioned, moving forward, assume that you pass tonight and then you get to this land decision at some future date, the staff cost goes up, considerably after that because we engage in the development process and we probably hire some consultants and things like that. In 2017, we spent about $500,000 on that whole effort, roughly speaking. And so, hope that answers your question.
So we could probably look at 2017 and, the site designs and, renderings that we produced. I think that was part of that $500,000. That today inflation adjusted is going to be less than $1 million, I would guess. Is that a fair assumption?
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Beloga. So I think it's a fair assumption, but I think that's probably overstating what we would invest in this first period because a lot of that work can be reused. And really, the Expo Organizing Committee needs to be engaged fully in the site design process. And so we expect them to participate more heavily in that this time around.
Good. And I think that's wise on the city's part to have that expectation. So if I can move on then. So the city enters into another option. And beyond the cost of the option, let's say that it's awarded. And the city is then the buyer of the land, or do we pass the option on to the committee? Who owns the land after it's purchased?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Beloga. I think the most likely scenario is that the city or Port Authority would either, again, buy the option or buy the land, period. And then the discussion about what happens to that land ensues, after the BIE vote in November of 2022. And there's a number of different ways that the project could be delivered. The project could be delivered in a way that a Expo entity or a developer buys the land and then builds the buildings and leases the building to the Expo during the event, and then sets up the leases afterwards. There's a paradigm where there's a public-private partnership that uses the financing capabilities but not money from the city or Port Authority to deliver that same paradigm and perhaps sells the buildings and site afterwards. Again, highlighting that even if we wanted to, we don't have the financial wherewithal to build 1 million square feet and finance that, nor would I assume that the council or the Port Authority put its levy, up against that, like they did back for the mall. I just perceive that the risk tolerance of this group is different than it was back in the early 80s with the mall project. We're in a different situation than we were back then. And so the answer is there's a lot of ways that it could be delivered after that point.
So, and that's normal at this point, and what I'm really asking for is a disclosure to the other members of council and Port Authority, some of who were not here when we did this arrangement last time, so it's informational for them and others who are watching. As far as the range of benefits to the city, could you've sort of done an estimate of the admissions tax, but not the liquor lodging tax that would accrue to the city. Do you have a range for that you might provide?
Mr. Rudling?
I didn't see one in the package.
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Beloga, sitting here today, we don't have those numbers.
I think last time we said it would be 2.5 to 3 times the admission tax. If my memory serves, is that in the range of what you might recall?
Mr. Verbrugge, do you recall?
Mr. Mayor and council members, commission members, I don't recall that number specifically, but to give a sense of scale, when we had an event like the Ryder Cup that was here, for that 1 week period, we were at max capacity in our hotels, right? This would be an event like that for 3 months. That's not to guarantee that we would be at max capacity in our hotels, but the catchment area for the attendance forecast is largely the 1 day's drive around the Twin Cities. And there are about 50 million people that live within 1 day drive of the Twin Cities. And so the attendance is largely driven off of that regional attendance, and most of that regional attendance will come from outside of the Twin Cities area. So it's reasonable to anticipate that there is going to be consistently strong occupancy during those 3 months that will perform at a significant increment above what the normal occupancy is. No idea what the normal occupancy will be in 2027, but it's significantly more than what we have right now, I think.
Thank you. I'll pass the baton to somebody else.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Mayor. And many of the questions that I had have been asked and answered, particularly on the financial side. So I appreciate that information. Just a couple of quick things. It was mentioned earlier about security with regards to this event. And I know that we have had a number of large events previously with the Super Bowl, with the Final Four, things of that nature. Do we have any concerns, or how will that impact our costs and things like that, and impact the community overall in terms of security for an event of this scale?
Mr. Rudling?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Nelson. Yeah, the only thing I can say right now as it relates to security on the project is, we did talk a lot about that back in 2017 and how you would secure the site with dignitaries coming in literally on a daily basis. The security costs are extremely high, and that the federal government in the past for large events like this has participated in those costs for the Olympics and things like that. So I know it's not a great answer, and we have a lot of questions sitting here today. We don't have answers to many of them, and that's why, again, we're suggesting a measured approach to engage in the project. it's a major to-do to figure out the security for an event like this, for sure.
Mr. Brugge?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, members, I think it's important to reiterate that the operating budget for the expo that the host committee has to put together assumes a certain amount of security costs. And as Shane said, that's all to be figured out in the coming years if we are indeed awarded. And to amplify on what Shane said about the security aspect, an event like this would have a designation as a national security event, and so there are significant resources, presumably, that would be applied at multiple levels to make that a reality. And we've already had some conversations with some of our partner agencies about that as well, who are important parts of that.
Okay. Thank you for the information. Next question quickly. What impact do we anticipate this having on residents and businesses, particularly those in the area? I know we've done a number of multifamily projects there. We've got the SIC development going in and a number of other businesses, just to make sure that, you know, people are seeing this for what it is. What would the impact of this type of event be for people within the community?
Mr. Rutland?
Mr. Mayor and Councilmember Nelson, so part of that work that we did back in 2017 focused on logistics, similar to that, parking, traffic, and so on. How do you get, you know, another 100,000 people into the district and out? As I was reviewing that over the past couple of weeks, one of the comments that I found that was interesting and well put by SRF, who did that work, was that while it's certainly not easy to do that, they said this is probably the best spot in the metro, in our metro, to do something like this if you were going to do it, because of the existing infrastructure. There's rail, you know, the freeways, etc. There's no doubt that there would be an impact to the businesses and folks that live in South Loop and nearby, but we've been planning for a huge increase in traffic and utilities in that area for literally decades. So I'm certainly not sitting here today, there would be no impact, but I'll reiterate what SRF said, is that there's no better place in the metro to do something like this than the South Loop area.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that. I know we're all very excited about the 494 project. Will that be completed prior to this event? At least, do we anticipate it would be, so that it's not under construction during this time?
Mr. Rutland?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Nelson, so as these boards know full well, we've been beating the drum about 494 for years. You know, the city and other stakeholders were critical, and you know, getting the various pots of money that are now committed to the project. And so the construction timeline for that project is still being determined, and we still have one piece of the project that we're trying to find funding for, which is the railroad bridge by Home Depot, so that that work that MnDOT will do, not the city again, you know, doesn't get done, and we have to come back and do the railroad bridge in order to provide the other lanes and throughput on the project. So we're still engaged in working with the other stakeholders to try to find that last bit of funding, that last $17-ish million to do that. I think their current timeline is to start construction on that project in 23 and a couple of years of construction. So in theory, that all gets done. Councilmember Beloga is on the 494 Corridor Commission, and he may, I see him raising his hand, he may even have more details than I do on that one.
Councilmember Beloga?
Thank you. The PAC is going to be meeting early next week, and I will have much more information after that. But to amplify what Shane was saying, the major bottleneck, of course, as we all know, is the 494-35 interchange. And that is scheduled to begin construction in 2023. And that is the only project that would start. That's phases, I think there's a total of 9 phases, and that encompasses 3 to 4, depending upon whether or not the railroad bridge gets sufficient funding. The remainder of the projects, there are, at least at the last PAC update, there are no start dates nor completion dates because there is no funding at this time dedicated to the project. MnDOT keeps trying to assure those of us who are more skeptical about that funding does get reallocated on a project such as this. But again, the unwillingness to predetermine what those funding sources are leaves it as an open question. And there is some projections that say that on the current phasing program, it may last as many as 7 to 9 years for construction, which would, of course, carry into and through the expo period of time.
Mr. Verbrugge?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members, I heard the collective gasp at that 7 to 9 year number, and I think all of us share that sentiment. I want to share with you that we had a discussion with the Transportation Commissioner this week and reiterated strongly the need for this not to be a forever project along 494, that it needs to have a defined timeline and then be done, because it's just a huge inconvenience to the traveling public, and 494 is the main cargo thoroughfare through the metro area. That sort of disruption would be unacceptable, and the commissioner understands that.
I'm just hoping Penn Avenue gets done.
Not our project. That's all I'll say there.
Councilmember Nelson, any additional questions?
No, that was my last question. I think that 494 project is a potential risk for us, and to continue to coordinate with the state agencies that are in charge of that. I also have a 35W Solutions Alliance meeting in the morning, and we'll talk about that. So I just want to make sure we're coordinated there. So if this does go to fruition, and obviously a lot of steps before we get there, but if it did move forward, that we make it as seamless as possible for people.
Agreed. Thank you. Council, any additional questions?
Any additional Port Authority questions?
We did say that we were going to take public comment on this. Carolyn, I apologize, I've forgotten our operator's name. It was so long ago now that we first mentioned. But I will ask our operator, is there anyone on the line to speak to item 2.2? Anyone wishing to speak to item 2.2?
No one is on the line. Please continue.
Thank you very much. So there's no one on the line. We have no one else with us here in the council chambers. I think to Councilmember Coulter's point, this is certainly this discussion, and if we decide to move forward, it's going to bring up plenty of public comment and public discussion. So I would look to our communication staff to make sure that we, again, if we move forward with this, that we have as much information as possible out there so people understand this as clearly as they can, and we can clear up the misinformation that I know will be coming forward on this as well. So council, any further discussion on this? Because what we are looking for tonight are a couple of different motions, one by the council and one by the Port Authority. Looking for a motion by the City Council to express support for Minnesota USA Expo's bid to bring Expo 2027 to Minnesota, and for Bloomington to actively pursue being the host city with a site in the South Loop.
Mayor, if no one else wants to move this forward, I'd be happy to make that motion.
Councilmember Lohman.
I'll go ahead and move a motion to express, the city council pass a motion to express its support for the Minnesota USA Expo bid to bring Expo 2027 to Minnesota, and for Bloomington to actively pursue being the host city with a site in South Loop.
Second.
We have a motion by Councilmember Lohman and a second by Councilmember Martin for the city council to express support for Expo, Minnesota USA Expo's bid to bring Expo 2027 to Bloomington. Any further discussion on this? Hearing none. Carolyn, please.
Beloga.
Aye.
Coulter.
Aye.
Loman.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Nelson.
Aye.
Bussey.
Aye. Motion carries. Carter. Oh, and Carter.
Carter.
Aye.
Now motion carries 7-0.
And I would entertain the motion for the Port Authority, similar motion.
I would make that motion identical to that articulated by Councilmember Loman, except for substituting Port Authority for the city council.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Hunt. Any further discussion? Not Carolyn, do you want to call the roll?
Bussey.
Aye.
Carter.
Aye.
Hunt.
Aye.
Keller.
Aye.
Lunds.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Erickson.
Aye.
Well, there we go.
So,
President Erickson?
Yep, Port Authority is 7-0, so very good.
Council, anything additional on this? Any additional comments? I think this is it's an exciting step. I do want to, I think we've said, I've lost count, I think it was a dozen times where we've used the phrase a measured approach, and I think that's exactly the right way to approach this. I think it is, it's exciting. I think it's, could be a transformational development for the city of Bloomington and frankly for the Twin Cities. And I think it would be, it would, as I said, be something that would be an exciting kind of thing that Bloomington and the state of Minnesota haven't seen before. So I'm excited about this and excited to move forward in a measured approach and logically and make sure we do this as carefully and as prudently as possible.
And I just would like to repeat kind of the same sentiments. I mean, when we started in this whole process, acquiring the old Mid-Stadium site in that 40-some years ago, the idea was for Bloomington to actively create opportunities and take control. And I think the results have been self-evident that we've created something, and I think it's only by continuing to explore these things on a very prudent basis, and I'm comfortable that we're doing that. And so, again, I'm excited also.
Very good. Mr. Rudling, anything to add? Mr. Verbrugge? Council, anything else?
Port Authority?
It's all been said. Very good. With that, Council, I would look for a motion to adjourn this evening's concurrent meeting with the Port Authority.
So moved.
So moved.
Got a motion by Councilmember Coulter, a second by Councilmember Beloga to adjourn the city council portion of this meeting. Hearing no further council discussion. Carolyn.
Beloga.
Aye.
Carter.
Aye.
Loman.
Aye.
Coulter.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Nelson.
Aye.
Bussey.
Aye. Motion carries 7-0. City council is adjourned.
And I will adjourn the Port Authority.
Very good. Thank you, Shane.